Can I share my screen, please? Can you let me?
Yeah, you can just hit screen share.
Oh yeah, I got it now. Thanks.
Okay.
I prepared a presentation for the panel. Okay. I would like to thank Carl and Roger and all the organizers for this wonderful event and this opportunity, and especially for helping us with the translation services for our panel. And of course, I would like to thank the translator, Carlos, for all his help. The panel will have 3 moments. First, I will present an introduction to it. Second, the participants, Angelica Gómez, Emma Vélez, and Nicolas Panotto, will present their papers. And we will have a final moment for an open dialogue between them and between the public on the topics and questions of the panel. The main objective of this panel, as expressed by the title, is to discuss in parallel the relevance of gender and religion within the decolonial term. As a premise of relatively easy acceptance, but in any case open to the discussion, it can be pointed out that for quite some time now, the connections between feminism, gender, and decoloniality have been explicitly thematized and analyzed. Maria Lugones is, without a doubt, a reference in this discussion with her famous text on the coloniality of gender. And after her, or parallel to her, a large number of researchers have productively and creatively discussed feminism and gender from a decolonial perspective. In Latin America, the voices of Ochi Curiel and Yuderquis Espinosa, among others, stand out. And to give a recent example concerning publications, the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia dedicated 2 issues in 2020 to the topic of decolonial feminism. In Spanish, we have a large number of very important publications that discuss this topic. So the expression decolonial feminism is increasingly common and relevant in academic studies and sociopolitical discussions, which does not mean, of course, that it is an issue devoid of edges, nuances, and ambiguities that call for academic and social dialogues and collaboration. On the other hand, in the case of religion and theology, it also seems to be a relatively easy to accept premise to affirm that until very recently, and with very few exceptions, maybe Dussel, decolonial thinkers did not have a clear, explicit, and systematic interest in religion and theology beyond pointing out the connections between them and coloniality. That is, besides rightly denouncing the roles played by Christianity in the process of coloniality, decolonial thought did not seem very interested in developing its affirmative and generative orientations concerning the decolonial potentialities that might be found within religions and theologies. This premise, of course, would also need to be more carefully thought through. That is to say, it would be worthwhile to ask and discuss, and to ask them directly in those cases where this is still possible, about the relations that these key thinkers of decoloniality have established between decoloniality and religions and theologies. We would surely find very interesting nuances and differences to be explored and analyzed. In any case, if we accept this second premise, we can also point out that this situation has begun to change, since now it is possible to find a great variety of publications, academic groups, and events in which the emphasis is placed on the possible decolonial dimensions of religions and theologies. In a recent review of specialized literature, I found that those researchers who claim to develop an explicit decolonial perspective on religion and theologies do so mainly based on the 3 following formal guidelines. First, the colonial studies of religion and theologies emphasize the colonial process of the invention of the Americas and the geopolitical developments that took place afterward as a historical moment, essential to both fully understand the relations between coloniality and religions, and to think of possible decolonial religious and theological alternatives. As one of these scholars puts it, and Jonte, I am quoting now from the text. A decolonial theory of religion would involve reconsidering the transatlantic process of imperial designing as the primary site for analyzing modern religion, a process which involves the reconfiguration of the religious, racial cartography in the Iberian Peninsula, Spanish Inquisition, the colonial encounter, and the theological legal debates on the humanity of the colonial order, the Valladolid debates. This takes us to the problem of the meaning of the concept of religion and theology, and the question of a possible decolonial understanding of these notions, or the need to get rid of them altogether. It seems that, with some exceptions, Latin American researchers are more comfortable with the terms spiritualities and ancestral knowledge, and prefer not to speak of religions or theologies of the original people. They prefer to use the term saber ancestral. For example, Silvia Marcos. One of the exceptions is, of course, Eleazar Lopez, who appears also there on the presentation. Second, the colonial studies of religions and theologies include topics and voices different from the traditional and dominant ones. A decolonial approach to religions and theologies dares to include other questions and topics that reveal what the traditional study of the religious phenomenon has hidden, especially related to situations of oppression and social and epistemic injustice in the framework of coloniality. In this sense, just to put an example, discussions on the proof for the existence of God or the death of God are replaced by discussions on the conditions of possibility and death of the imperial, colonial, and patriarchal God. Third, the colonial studies of religions and theologies develop their research by using methodologies committed to praxis. There is already a wide variety of literature on what it means to do research with the colonial methodologies. It is worth mentioning, for example, Linda Smith's approach, which shows that the key feature is to accept and assume the impossibility of being neutral. In Achille Mbembe's words, a quote, "It is about questioning the Western epistemological traditions that defend a profound detachment between the researcher and the research subject, especially the methodologies that assume that the knowing subject is capable of knowing the world without being part of it, and that from that neutral position, they are also capable of producing universal knowledge." Based on these three formal guidelines, the decolonial perspectives on religions and literature, the decolonial perspectives on religions and theologies found thank you, Carlos. I'm sorry. Lo siento. Voy a ir más despacio. Okay. Based on these three formal guidelines, the decolonial perspectives on religions and theologies found in the academic literature develop their ultimate goal. That is, their critiques of the modern, colonial, capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric world system, to use the expression of Ramon Grosvogel. I hope you were able to get it and translate that long expression, Carlos. Okay. Now, it is not difficult to see, especially the guidelines 2 and 3 can be understood as lessons that the colonial perspectives oriented towards religions and theologies have taken from feminist critiques of Western patriarchy. This would be one of the reasons why it is essential for those of us interested in thinking about religions and theologies from a decolonial perspective to take into account the discussions of coloniality and gender. A second reason has to do with the leading roles played by colonial religions and colonial theologies within the development of the patriarchal system. In this context, Lugones' text is once again highly relevant. At first glance, from this perspective, feminism and religion and theology would not seem to be compatible. However, a secularist critique that flatly denies any liberating and emancipatory value to religion does not take into account the different feminist, religious, and theological alternatives that have been raised within the framework of the colonial critiques. And in the presentation, the slide, you can see an example of these key figures like Yvonne Guevara, Rita Segato, Silvia Marquez, and many others. I hope that what has been said so far will serve as a brief introduction to the theme of the panel, which will be further developed with the participation and papers of Angelica Gómez, Emma Vélez, and Nicolas Panotto. I want to finish now by formulating some questions that might connect the works of Angelica, Emma, and Nicolas with the topic of the panel, and that might be useful for the dialogues in the third part of the panel. First, does it make sense to speak of a decolonial conception of religions and theologies, especially with the dominant Christian tradition? Can we find elements and dimensions within Christianity and or the other so-called world religions, or do we need to just radically delink from them? Second, are there substantial or important differences that are still worth affirming between decoloniality and postcoloniality concerning the theoretical and practical approaches to gender on the one hand and to religious and theologies on the other? The third question refers to the meaning, history, and nature of decolonial feminisms and the relevance that the category of gender should have for a truly decolonial term. The fourth question refers to the precursors of the decolonial term and their views on the role of religion and theology within decoloniality. The fifth question refers to the learnings and unlearnings that a decolonial approach to religions and theologies can do from decolonial feminism. And similarly, it refers to what decolonial feminism might gain by approaching explicitly religions and theologies in a decolonial way. The sixth question has to do with the difference that might exist between, on the one hand, a decoloniality from and in the South, and on the other, a decoloniality from and in the North, of course, related to the topic of our panel. The sixth question refers to the fact that methodology seems to be a crucial issue in this debate. So I would like to ask our panelists and our public how do you understand that challenge? You know, how do, based on their own experience, how they have understood and assumed this decolonial challenge in their academic work. And the eighth question has to do with the topic of the conference, of course, about the consequences of all the above for the rethinking of the notions of sovereignty, nationality, territory, mainly concerning the struggles of the ordinary people. And 9 and 10 means, of course, that there are surely many more questions that we can talk and discuss in the third part of the panel, and also in our academic work further. So now, following the order of our panel, and thanking Carlos for his help in the translation, please, Angelica, could you continue?
Vale, muchas gracias. Voy a compartir pantalla yo también. Ay. Ahí estoy compartiendo. ¿Me confirman, por favor? Todavía no. ¿Están viendo mi pantalla o no? Ahí.
Ok, ya.
Bueno, buenas tardes y muchas gracias a Javier, al profesor Carl, por la invitación y por la hospitalidad también para acogerme en mi propio idioma en este interesantísimo panel. Tengo que decir, Javier, que evidentemente tus preguntas me han implicado y han sido súper estimulantes para repensar también mi trayectoria de investigación, que, como te dije en una conversación inicial, no porta particularmente sobre la religión, a pesar de que me he interesado por el feminismo decolonial, y ahí, por supuesto, que me he topado con temas que tienen que ver con el orden moral, sobre todo cuando localizo la investigación en contextos situados, que es una de las epistemologías que se cruzan entre lo decolonial y entre los feminismos globales.
Could we slow down a little bit so the translation can go a little quicker slowly, because it's yeah, like we did with you. If you could ask her to slow down a little bit.
Ok, estoy yendo muy rápido. Gracias. Ok, entonces he titulado mi ponencia La edad como orden moral, una lectura interseccional. Para esto he querido situar la reflexión en una investigación empírica, ¿no? En una investigación empírica de mi tesis doctoral. Es una pregunta, es una ponencia que abordará las formas de gobierno sobre los cuerpos a través de la sexualidad. Y lo que quiero hacer con esto es situar también no solo el género, sino la edad en el centro como una categoría de análisis crítico, para tomar las palabras de Scott cuando se refiere al género, que creo yo podría acercarnos a pensar las dinámicas morales y religiosas también en la producción discursiva de los otros o de la otredad. Y también los procesos de resistencia y de contestación de los sujetos. Ahí va bien, Carlos, la velocidad. Listo. Bueno, entonces decía que me apoyaré de una experiencia de investigación de mi tesis doctoral, que fue terminada en 2015. Y esta experiencia...
Sorry, I hate to intervene again, but we need to slow down the Spanish delivery so that we can get the English. We have to do that with translation, because it's not a translation. It's a it's a human translation. So if we could slow down the presentation, please.
Más despacio.
Hello?
Ok, entonces voy a intentar hacerlo más despacio. Entonces, ok,
Hello?
bueno, decía que me apoyaré en una investigación de mi tesis doctoral que fue terminada en el 2015 e interrogó las diferencias de un lado en la concepción del embarazo adolescente en Colombia, de un lado movilizados por funcionarios de salud que se desplazan del casco urbano y de otro lado los significados sobre el embarazo que construye la población joven rural. Son dos grupos diferentes. Voy a entender que crecer es un proceso que se constituye por mecanismos y por reglas, pero también por experiencias y por relaciones. Y este proceso es vivido por los individuos a través de sus cuerpos, particularmente por la entrada a la sexualidad, que juega un rol central en la interacción con la sociedad mayoritaria. Y con la sociedad mayoritaria me voy a referir a la sociedad urbana y, por supuesto, a la producción de una moral con elementos religiosos. Esta moral puede excluir aquellas experiencias comunitarias que transgreden las normas mayoritarias y podrían ser leídas, yo creo, desde el orden de la decolonialidad. Realicé mi trabajo de campo en Nariño. Es una región que se encuentra al sureste de Colombia, en la frontera con el Ecuador. Representa casi el 4% de la población nacional, pero es mayoritariamente rural y es una región pluriétnica y multicultural que tiene 6 comunidades indígenas y comunidades afrodescendientes. El trabajo de campo, como decía, se desarrolló en 2 grupos. En el primer grupo hubo funcionarios de un programa que se llama Servicios Amigables para Jóvenes y Adolescentes, que es una estrategia de intervención en salud sexual y reproductiva que está dirigida a población joven y adolescente, entendida como jóvenes que tienen entre 13 y 25 años de edad. Y es un modelo que es importado, es transnacional, internacional, importado de otros países y se ejecuta en otros contextos de América Latina y también en algunos países de África. El segundo grupo poblacional son jóvenes que habitan en la zona rural y es población mestiza. Se identifica como población mestiza y construye una identidad minoritaria desde su pertenencia rural. Las comunidades a las cuales pertenecen los jóvenes estudiados registran una importante actividad agrícola, una producción de materias primas con débil tecnificación, ingresos precarios, cuentan con una escolarización de nivel medio y secundaria y todos profesan una religión católica. Entonces, para construir un objeto de estudio como este, y ahí contesto un poco a una de las preguntas que tú planteas, Javier, abordé aquello que las feministas llaman una epistemología del saber situado. es decir, que incluí mi propia experiencia de investigadora como un dato de análisis, entre otros. Y al enterarme que, dadas mis decisiones reproductivas, que en ese momento implicaron retrasar la maternidad, privilegiando un proyecto académico en el extranjero, yo encarnaba el ideal de juventud que se propone desde los funcionarios de salud. El grupo de jóvenes interactúa conmigo como si se tratase de uno de los agentes de salud. Entonces, mis primeros abordajes etnográficos me permiten entender la manera en que los jóvenes se relacionan con las normas institucionales sanitarias y la manera en que estos se incorporan, y ahí aparece el orden moral, resisten y ponen en tensión las normativas de edad movilizadas por las instituciones que se definen a partir del comportamiento reproductivo y la relación con el embarazo llamado precoz, ¿no? Algunos resultados rápidamente que pueden aportar a esta discusión que tú propones, Javier. Hay que decir que en esta comunidad estudiada, la imbricación de la categoría de edad y la categoría de género es indispensable para entender la experiencia de la procreación y de la sexualidad también, y cómo se pone en tensión la moral sexual. Crecer es, para los funcionarios de salud, acercarse a la mayoría racial, en este caso a la mayoría urbana, y a sus comportamientos procreativos. Es a partir de la comprensión de la construcción discursiva del embarazo adolescente, donde participa la institución salud, y las resistencias comunitarias, donde se encuentra el componente fundamental del pasaje a la adultez y la contestación de la minoría étnica y la minoría de edad, porque vamos a entender que la minoría étnica es una minoría de edad también, porque es infantilizada. Entonces, cuando indago en el segundo grupo, la dimensión experiencial desde un enfoque biográfico narrativo, tú preguntabas por metodologías que respondan a unas epistemologías del sur y a unas epistemologías decoloniales y situadas también. Es indagando la dimensión experiencial, donde encontramos embarazos previstos y conscientes para cuestionar la categoría de embarazos no esperados y precoces, propia del discurso sanitario y asociada a una producción de la infancia, a una producción discursiva de la infancia. Entonces, es el carácter de precocidad del mismo lo que no se define ni según los jóvenes, ni según la comunidad misma, desde la edad de la llegada, sino más bien por las condiciones familiares, morales y también me atrevería a decir religiosas que lo rodean, particularmente la existencia o no de una familia hegemónica, de un modelo de familia hegemónica, la conformación de una pareja legítima en el matrimonio católico, heterosexual y monógamo. No obstante, esto, por supuesto, cambia según la experiencia de género. Por eso la dimensión experiencial me parece fundamental al indagar esto. La vigilancia permanente sobre los cuerpos de las mujeres les impide establecer relaciones afectivas intermedias entre la soltería y el matrimonio, salvo en los casos donde la maternidad aparece, ¿no? El temor a las consecuencias de ser descubierto en el ejercicio de una sexualidad prenupcial es una de las causas de resistencia al uso de la anticoncepción, muy distinto a lo que se plantea en el discurso sanitario. Este acceso frecuentemente, asociado frecuentemente a los servicios de salud, no se contempla como una posibilidad antes de la llegada del primer embarazo, puesto que el embarazo marca el paso a la adultez desde la perspectiva sanitaria, pero no siempre a ojos de la comunidad. Después de este evento, la interacción con los servicios de salud, de orientación y de planificación no es solo una posibilidad, sino un imperativo en la experiencia de los adolescentes. Entonces, para la comunidad, digamos que la norma está en la necesidad de formar una pareja monógama, heterosexual y con hijos. Esa es la norma comunitaria distinta a la norma sanitaria. Y creo que la norma comunitaria tiene elementos morales y religiosos. Sin embargo, en la experiencia juvenil, y ahí es donde yo veo una reapropiación de la norma moral y religiosa, el bebé aparece como una inversión del orden establecido para formar un hogar o para formar una familia. Entonces, digamos que hay incorporación de las normas, pero también hay procesos de contestación, ¿no? Entonces, podríamos decir que el vínculo afectivo ocupa un lugar fundamental. Las relaciones sexuales preceden el compromiso del matrimonio católico. El embarazo aparece como una forma de dar legitimidad a una sexualidad activa y a una relación de pareja que no requiere siempre del rito del matrimonio. La pareja parental toma una importancia que supera la connotación del matrimonio, ¿no? Entonces, el embarazo se escoge como un medio para marcar el rito de paso a la edad adulta, para salir de una situación coercitiva que implica ocupar múltiples lugares de subalternidad. Mujer campesina, adolescente y precarizada, ¿no? Con la esperanza y bajo la condición de encontrar una relación afectiva y filial para toda la vida. Hay que señalar, por supuesto, que aunque el embarazo no se planifica en todos los casos, es un evento que está siempre contemplado como una posibilidad vinculada a ese lazo afectivo con el compañero, ¿no? Cuando hablamos de estos casos. Y esto, por supuesto, que cuestiona el discurso sanitario que se ha establecido de manera casi que hegemónica en todos los programas de salud sexual y de prevención, que son programas internacionales. La llegada del embarazo en condiciones de soltería y afrontando el abandono del compañero sí supone un fracaso que distancia a las mujeres de su condición de adultas y las sitúa en categoría de madres adolescentes, que es una población susceptible a ser intervenida por programas transnacionales o internacionales de salud como minoría en términos de etnicidad, en términos de género y en términos de edad, con unas normas sanitarias muy definidas y encaminadas más bien a la prevención del embarazo, pero no al ejercicio pleno de derechos sexuales y reproductivos en unas intervenciones situadas y localizadas, que creo que ahí hay una respuesta un poco a la discusión sobre soberanía y territorio que tú planteas dentro del panel, Javier también. Entonces, brevemente, no había puesto esta, pensé que estaba ahí. Pensé que estaba en esa. Abordo la categoría de edad, diría, como un orden de comportamientos y de imperativos morales relacionados con la sexualidad y con la procreación. Y creo que esta categoría tendría que contemplarse dentro de los análisis de interseccionalidad, ¿no? La ausencia del respeto de esos imperativos de comportamiento esperados en las sociedades minoritarias es usado en la producción discursiva de otredades, en este caso una otredad étnica, las mujeres rurales campesinas, pero también de una otredad que es infantilizada y es nombrada en términos de edad. El orden de las edades empieza a ser definido por las instituciones sanitarias y se contrapone a perspectivas comunitarias y en una dinámica donde intervienen tensiones del grupo mayoritario, que en este caso es la comunidad urbana, y es interesante ver cómo aparece lo urbano y lo rural versus el minoritario, que es el infantil, y las generaciones, y la moral religiosa dentro de la comunidad, ¿no? La moral religiosa, que significa la sexualidad, en qué casos es legítima, pero también esto es reapropiado. El cuerpo de las mujeres es el escenario sobre el cual se establece tanto la norma como la contestación, y eso es interesante de ver. Para garantizar el orden, el cuerpo permanece bajo la vigilancia sanitaria y la disciplina familiar, que yo lo entendería desde la perspectiva de Julieta Paredes, de lo que ella llama un entronque patriarcal, ¿no? Tanto la vigilancia sanitaria como la vigilancia comunitaria sobre las mujeres. Porque digamos que la vigilancia sanitaria encarna un poco más los ideales de crecer y de comportamientos de la sexualidad de la sociedad mayoritaria. Entonces podríamos leerlo como portadora también de procesos coloniales, y eso es interesante, no solamente emancipadora, sino también colonial. Entonces creo que la lectura de la procreación no puede hacerse desde las categorías etarias de juventud y niñez de las sociedades mayoritarias urbanas, ¿no? Y esa es como un poco la conclusión. La redefinición de las fronteras de la edad participa también de la definición y de las distinciones entre un nosotros mayoritario y un ellos que es racial y que es étnico. Cuando se cuestionan o se transforman los órdenes de las edades, los jóvenes también resisten y transforman esas fronteras. Y la invitación que me surge desde este coloquio, que es realmente una pregunta que no me la había planteado tan explícitamente, es qué elementos religiosos han jugado un papel fundamental en los procesos de resistencia y contestación de los sujetos, de los jóvenes, de las jóvenes mujeres, para transformar los imperativos morales, pero también para resistir a experiencias coercitivas que están dadas por la imbricación de múltiples categorías que implican experiencias marginales en el ejercicio de derechos sexuales y reproductivos. Ser mujer, ser campesina, ser niña o ser adolescente y ser precarizada también en términos económicos. Y creo que es una pregunta que queda muy abierta como para profundizar. Esa sería mi presentación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Angelica.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos.
Emma, you're going to continue, right?
Yes, yeah, I just didn't want to jump the order. Carlos, I shared with you my script. This is what I'll be working from, so if that's helpful, For the translation, I'll be speaking in English. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You're welcome. And let me go ahead. I'm working with a lot of screens. 1 second. Okay. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah.
All right. So first, I want to say gracias to my fellow panelists and muchísimas gracias to Javier for gathering us here today. I'm coming to this call from the United States, specifically from the Midwest in central Illinois. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So I think it's important to start my remarks for this panel that aims to reflect on the complex relationships between the coloniality of gender and religion by acknowledging the land that holds me today. So I'm coming to the call from the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Weah, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. So these lands were the traditional territory of these nations prior to their forced removal, and continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for sovereignty and survivance. So I want to sort of follow that land acknowledgement by talking a little bit about my work and introducing you to the subject of La Virgen de Guadalupe that I'm going to be speaking about today. So my presentation engages the panel's themes of decoloniality, religion, and gender through the lens of Latina and Latinx decolonial feminisms and the complex figure of La Virgen de Guadalupe. So my engagement with La Virgen de Guadalupe is part of a larger work. It's the book project that I'm working on right now that invokes the historias of las tres madres. So for those who don't know, these are La Malinche, La Llorona, and La Virgen de Guadalupe. So for the presentation today, I'm focusing on La Virgen as a syncretic figure who enables us to more closely examine the complex and contradictory interweaving of coloniality, gender, and religion, as well as possibilities for both decoloniality and decolonization. Today, as Chicana Tejana feminist Gloria Anzalúa asserts, La Virgen de Guadalupe is the single most potent religious, political, and cultural image of the Chicano Mexicano. Indeed, her image can be found adorning everything from velas santas and murals to cobijas turned fashion and tattoos on the flesh of the faithful. As Nuestra Madre, our mother, La Morenita, the brown-skinned virgin, and La Virgen de Guadalupe, she's regarded as the patron saint of Mexicanx and Chicanx peoples on both sides of La Frontera. As Luz Calvo contends, quote, the Virgin of Guadalupe is a polyvalent sign, able to convey multiple and divergent meanings and deployed by different groups for contradictory political ends, close quote. The multiplicity that inheres in La Virgen is precisely why I invoke her historia, as we think together about the possibilities for decolonizing the logics of the coloniality of power, race, and gender, and the place of religion and spirituality in these decolonizing projects. I contend that this semiotic resignification is a decolonial praxis that has been working in and through the figure of Guadalupe since her apparition in Tepeyac in 1516 and continues to operate through her historia today. So I want to start speaking about La Virgen and orienting us to her historia through the decolonial sensibility and practice that Maria Lugones has termed faithful witnessing. Though the concept of faithful witnessing is not one of Lugones's most central or developed concepts, for example, those who are familiar with her work might know about the concepts of world traveling, complex communication, or the coloniality of gender. But the concept of faithful witnessing holds an important place in her theorizing at several key moments in various texts across her corpus. In sketching out an initial snapshot of her understanding of the concept, I've included a quotation here for you on the screen. I'm not going to read through it in the interest of time, but I will speak about the aspects of this, this concept that I think are important, and they're also highlighted for you on the screen. So there are several aspects of faithful witnessing that are important to note in this quotation. According to Lugones, to witness faithfully requires developing new sensibilities and sensitivities to multiple worlds of sense and ways of being, what Audre Lorde calls our non-dominant differences, which is to say, the abundant diversity of life in its myriad manifestations. And she calls for us to engage in this attunement to multiplicity against the oppressive grain. Faithful witnesses also understand that conceiving of ontology through difference is not destructive, but infinitely generative in ways that cannot be determined ahead of time. Faithful witnesses reject a teleological vision of liberation and embrace possibilities that cannot yet be conceived of under the current modern colonial gender system. Faithful witnesses also affirm that we catch glimpses of resistant worlds every day in the most mundane of details. Further, it's important to note that faithful witnessing is not a passive mode, but an engaged one. Faithful witnesses must contend with multiplicity in all of its difficulty and messiness. And it's as such a faithful witness that I call on La Virgen as both nuestra madre and nuestra maestra, so as both our mother and our teacher. Born out of the aftermath of the conquest, La Virgen de Guadalupe's historia is deeply intertwined with colonialism and the continued legacy of coloniality in the Americas. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. In particular, some of the following questions that guide my thinking on the power of La Virgen's historia for a decolonial feminist praxis are the following, and I placed these questions on the slide for you. So the questions that I'm thinking about in my work, and the ones that I want to share with you today are, how does La Virgen de Guadalupe enable us to examine the interweaving of coloniality, gender, and religion, as well as possibilities for decoloniality and decolonization? In what ways does the historia of La Virgen reveal the foundational contradictions at the heart of the colonial modern gender system and the coloniality of gender? How do we make sense of the kinds of epistemic resistance and disobedience at work in the figure of Guadalupe? How does she foreground forms of epistemic resistance and disobedience that complicate calls for delinking? And here I'm especially thinking about Walter Miñolo's work, as well as Aníbal Quijano's work and their articulation of delinking. And last, what lessons for decoloniality and decolonization can we learn from Chicanx and Mexicanx feminist and queer resignifications of La Virgen. And so just for some additional background on how I'm thinking about these questions and the figure of La Virgen de Guadalupe, I want to share a little bit about the way that I understand La Virgen de Guadalupe as a syncretic figure. As such a figure, she binds the Marian image of Our Lady of Guadalupe of Extremadura, Spain, to the Nahua goddess Tonantzin. Irene Lara explains that, quote, Tonantzin forms part of the story of transculturation, that is, of cultural loss, cultural persistence, and the creation of hybrid cultural forms mediated through power relations in 16th century Mesoamerica, close quote. In this way, La Virgen de Guadalupe can be understood as exemplifying the processes of semiotic resignification through which the logics of the coloniality of power, race, and gender are imposed. Through this semiotic resignification, Tonantzin is relegated to the dark side of coloniality modernity, and La Virgen is consigned to the light side. According to Maria Lugones's account of the coloniality of gender, the fragility and sexual passivity, as well as the purity of white, bourgeois, European women, was given meaning by juxtaposing them to non-white colonized women. Thus, through the coloniality of gender, non-white colonized women are, and this is a quote from Lugones, quote, characterized along a gamut of sexual aggression and perversion, and is strong enough to do any sort of labor, close quote. It's precisely these traits that were applied to indigenous goddesses like Tonantzin during the conquest. This is significant because, as Lara argues, this maligning of goddesses transposes to the maligning of actual Nahua women, particularly healers, midwives, and quote unquote harlots. So Tonantzin then gets characterized as sexually deviant and perverse, and this in turn is taken to justify the violence directed against those who fall on the dark side of coloniality modernity. On the light side, La Virgen is figured as the eternal and idealized feminine, offering the comforts and protection of the maternal womb. In this way, the coloniality of gender installs the Virgen Puta dichotomy, or the virgin whore dichotomy, that today is still very much attached to La Virgen de Guadalupe. And we can think about this especially in what sociologists have termed Marianismo, right? The culture of Marianismo. Okay, so, and this is the next section, heretical revisions. So I don't want to leave this, the historia, the way that I'm thinking about La Virgen, you know, merely with, you know, the split, right, between Tonantzin and Guadalupe. So this section, I'm going to kind of complicate this analysis. So as a figure who's birthed from the interstices between cultures, cosmologies, and vastly different worlds of sense, Guadalupe is a synecdoche that bespeaks the foundational contradictions at the heart of the colonial modern gender system that has installed itself as the universal world order. However, despite its efforts, the logics of coloniality are and have been unable to fully suppress the aspects of Guadalupe that have been relegated to the dark side of coloniality modernity and continue to circulate in serpentine ways through the historia of la Virgen as Nuestra Madre, and, as I argue, serve as resources for decolonial feminist praxis and resistance that function as what Sylvia Wynter and Nelson Maldonado Torres term acts of revelatory heresy. In his essay, Epistemology, Ethics, and the Time Space of Decolonization, Nelson Maldonado Torres reflects on the way in which decolonial and post-continental philosophies, quote, appear as heresy to both dominant secular and religious institutions, close quote. And he contends that the goals of these acts of intervention and heresy are twofold, and I've placed these two goals on the slide. So the first goal is to, in the words of Maldonado Torres, it's to subvert multiple structures and interlocked chains of oppression. So this is the dismantling work of decoloniality and decolonization. The second goal involves the generative aspects of the decolonial project, which Maldonado Torres defines as, quote, new ways of thinking about our collective humanity and about projects that seek to affirm what is best in it, close quote. And on this slide, I kind of expanded this. So not only new ways of thinking, but also new ways of being, and also the creation of otro mundos, right? So of other worlds. So these germinative goals are what Wynter has also called acts of revelatory heresy that empower those who have been oppressed in colonial contexts. Appealing to this sense of heresy, to conclude, I want to leave us with the heretical decolonial visions of Chicanx and Mexicanx feminist nueva mythologists or new mythologists. Okay, so in particular, I want to leave us with the heretical vision of Fancy Lupe, from Mexican artist, director, performer, and dramaturg Pepe Romero, a leading figure in the queer art, nightlife, and theater scene in Mexico City. So what we have on the screen is an image from the promotional materials, and playing Fancy Lupe here is Alan Balthazar, who is Afro-Mexicano, as well as an oración or a prayer to Fancy Lupe. And the prayer is in Spanish. I represented its original text here for you. And it's part of the broader constellation of the performance piece. So Fancy Lupe, a play and a piece of performance art, memorializes Romero's own past, as well as the repressed history of Mexico City's queer community. As Caitlin Donahue describes Romero's Lupe, quote, she is representative of a world in which Mexico is free to love all of its sons and daughters, regardless of body type, gender, or sexual proclivity, close quote. Reclaiming Tonantzin Guadalupe and writing it, with the hyphen, and transforming her into a more inclusive and loving mother, Romero's creative work can be understood as enacting the decolonial semiotics that Chela Sandoval has theorized as meta-ideologizing. Meta-ideologizing works within and through dominant and oppressive ideological forms to both ensure survival and to engender social justice. Far from delinking from the complexities of Guadalupe as the principal symbol of Catholicism in Mexico, as well as the coloniality of gender, Romero works in and through these dominant ideologies in order to create an altogether different Virgen, Fancy Lupe. As a faithful witness, I read Romero's Fancy Lupe as generating a semiotic rupture that reveals heterosexism and homophobia as artifacts of coloniality that do not necessarily adhere in the Historia of Tonantzin Guadalupe. Romero's fantastical and queer presentation of Fancy Lupe, like Alma Lopez's Our Mother, which is also a very famous Chicana reclamation of Guadalupe that I began the slides with, and that will appear on the last slide in just a moment. They confront the libidinal investments that surround La Virgen de Guadalupe as the Gran Señora of Mexico. Following Anzaldúa then, we can understand Fancy Lupe as a Dios ex, carved and chiseled from Romero's own entrails, who provides a direct challenge to traditional understandings of who is holy and worthy of veneration, replacing the feminine, brown but not too brown, mestiza body of the traditional Guadalupe with a queer Afro-Mexican body. And so, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Carlos, for your work and translating. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversations that will happen after Nicolas's presentation. So muchas gracias.
Thank you, Emma.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Carlos, I sent you my presentations in Spanish or in English, so maybe it could help in the translation. Well, my presentation is titled Decolonizing Secularizations, Contradictions, Challenges, and Epistemological Proposals in Post and Decolonial Theory. What I would like to share very briefly in this presentation is the concise analysis of how religious question is addressed in the body of post and decolonial studies. I use this taxonomy, at least in this case, to refer to the three main currents within this field. First of all, subaltern studies, post-colonial studies, and the decolonial turn. Although each of these theories presents a distinctive nuances and approaches, I also believe that they have some transversal axes that bring them together, in which I would like just to highlight two of them. First of all, the need for a critical theory on the place of the colonial residue that permeates the contemporary sociocultural and political logics. And in second place, the focus on the epistemic resignification that confronts the modern colonial epistemology that, following Aníbal Quijano, configures power relations, subjectivity processes, and modes of knowledge construction. Applying to this scheme of, to the topic of our interest, that is religious studies, we can ask the following questions regarding to the post and decolonial approach. How do we understand the dynamics of religious subjectivities or identities? What is the place of religious in power structures? And how does the religious intervene as an analytical category in the constructions of processes in the socio-political knowledge? Although each of these fields and questions requires a separated, in-depth approach, in this case, we will try to make a cross-analysis based on a quick review of the use of a fairly common category within these theories, such as the concept of secularization. So let us begin. So we'll look at the time. So let us begin with a brief review of how this term, secularization, is approached by some of the references in these three currents I just mentioned above. A classic of post-colonial theory, as we know, is the work of Edward Said. In his book, Orientalism, he argues that secularization is a process of reconstruction, reorganization, and redistribution of secular frameworks proper to the 18th century European culture, especially, and he would say, in the fields of race, color, origin, temperament, character, and the types of these distinctions between Christianity and the others. This process will frame the very meaning of Orientalism, will Said said. Very much as like a Smithian vein or Smithian perspective, Said posits that the modern Orientalist uses Christian messianic logic in a secular key to bring Orient out of oscurantism and its alienation. The Orientalist method is that of a man who creates new worlds, just as God has created the old one. In this way, Orientalism does not imply an objective knowledge, Said will say, of the East, but the use of a set of structures inherited from the past, secularized and reformulated from certain disciplines, for example, like philology, that constitute naturalized substitutes from what he calls Christian supernaturalism. In another renewed and known work of Said, that is The World, the Text, and the Critic, this is a text of 1983, he will be even more pointed with respect of how he defines the strictly religious in the framework of the process of secularization within Orientalism. It is interesting the chiasmos of Said in this book. And why? Because in the introduction, he will title Secular Criticism, and in the conclusion, he would say religious criticism. And in the later part, he will state, like, and I quote, like culture, religion thus supplies us with system of authority and canons of order whose usual consequence is either to impose submission or to gain adherence. And I close quote. From here, Said will highlight as worrying that at the present, there is an increase of appeals to the extra-human, to the esoteric, to the secret, where the magical, the use of sacred text, and or the appeal to divine mandates is nothing more than a consequence of exaggeration in the face of uncertainty, disappointment, and paradox. In other words, we can name this like a new version of the religious as the opium of the people, if you allowed me the irony. All this will reflect a preference for the security of belief systems rather than a critical activity and consciousness, will Said say. And now I quote, the modern critic, he will conclude in the last sentence of his book, once an intellectual, has become a cleric in the worst sense of the term. In a proposal, this proposal of Said's work has been strongly questioned by various authors, such as Timothy Fitzgerald, sorry, I don't know if I pronounce well the surname, who argues that Said uses the notion of secularism, in a completely uncritical way, without questioning the secular religion binomial that modernity establishes to legitimize the ontology of modernity. Beyond the fact that Said relates the idea of secularization to a configuration of Christian notion of self in Europe as a platform of development of modernity, he maintains the secular religion dichotomy to suggest an stereotyped and prejudiced idea of the religious as primitive, inferior, superstitious, as opposed to the critical sense of a non-religious, let's say secular, practice of language. And thus, as Fitzgerald will conclude in this opinion, if the criticism of religion ever gets completed, then the notion of secular criticism will be meaningless. If we go to now from the post-colonial theory to the decolonial turn, one of its fundamental proposals is the idea that modernity exists thanks to the processes of colonization. One cannot be understood without the other. In comparisons to Said, the decolonial turn will claim that the process of modernization must be traced back to the arrival and massacre of Europeans in Abya Yala. Therefore, for this current, the place of religion, and more specifically Christian church, will have a fundamental place in the construction of the idea of America, the racial classification of human beings, and the implantation of Christian Western values. This context affirmed this secular epistemology over the theological epistemology within the Western history. This is what Mignolo will say. And this has two goals. First of all, that this to empower the epistemology within Western history, and second, to disaccredit and reject all non-Western epistemologies through the stigmatization of ideas such as tradition, myth, cosmology, belief, and others. In other words, the decolonial turn, and more specifically in Walter Mignolo's influential proposal, he presented secularization as part of the process of legitimation of the singularity, epistemology, and proposal of modern and Eurocentric progress, where Christian matrix operated as a mechanism to deepen the dynamics of exclusion of non-Western subjects. It is here where studies of racialization processes and indigenous studies assume a central place for decolonial turn. But again, the hegemonic secular religion divisions continues to operate in decolonial turn, as the religion is presented rather under its functionality around the process of coloniality of knowledge. In a way, the tensions and dynamics between Christianity and other religious identities, especially indigenous, within the process of secularization, lost its religious specificity. Basically, it is considered only as a counter-knowledge opposed to the Western epistemology. These counter-hegemonic positions are opposed to the hegemonic epistemology as a colonial episteme, but not from a religious particularity. And finally, we have the Subaltern Studies that propose, in turn, another approach both to the religious and the secularization itself. Already Spivak's studies, we can find the proposal that one way to diversify the definitions of what she called the other Asias is precisely to broaden and de-Westernize the analysis of Islam as another possible historical entry to understand the plurality of Asias. We also have in the Wanendra Pandey's classic study on the Indo-Muslim struggle in India during the 80s as a fragment of the official national history that is excluded in India on the basis of a secularity that is presented as a essential and perennial subject abstracted from the identity conditions, in this case and under the name of Indian nation. In this study, the process of secularization not only refers to the legitimation of Western hegemonic and Christian logic, but also to a despoliticization of the popular subject as they are emptied of their religious particularity. In the same vein, Ashish Nandi, in a classic essay entitled An Anti-Secularism Manifesto, originally published in 1985, raises three criticisms from what it called Gandhian perspective on the modern ideology of secularization. First, it ignores the finer difference within traditions, but maintains a more complex difference about modern culture. In this sense, secularism differentiates between vulgar and non-vulgar version of Marxism, an oppressive and non-oppressive place in the West, but refuses to see the religious phenomenon from the same paradox, promoting rather an homogeneous vision of beliefs. The second critique that Nandi will do is that official secularism, and here is speaking about the Indian establishment, limits democratic processes by truncating the political personality of citizenship, in this case by refusing its religious dimension. Instead of critically deconstructing modern dichotomies between politics and cultures or private and public, this perspective of secularism maintain it. And finally, Nandi will argue that secularism is totally insensitive to the politic of cultures, and I quote, "It sees the believer as a person with an inferior political consciousness, and it celebrates the fact that we live more and more in a world where all faiths and cultures, except modernity, are in recession." In summary, we can suggest that Said and Mignolo, representing a certain mainstream within post-colonial and decolonial theories, approach the problematic of secularization based on how it operates in modernity, on modernity religion separation as a mechanism to legitimize the construction of the Western episteme and its authority and self-reference, but they maintain uncritically, the distinctions on what is properly religious, without showing that it is not their religious as a whole that acts within the process of secularization, but a certain hegemonic Christian perspective. In other words, both approaches start from a modern-centric concept of religious, and doing so end up promoting the reductionist analysis of the role of the religious, a narrow reading of the place of religious within the colonial matrices, demarcate a set of distinctions that ultimately leaves the other processes of politic subjectivation, even progressive or critical, and promotes an stigmatizing views on religious experiences of non-hegemonic groups or called minorities. On the other hand, Subaltern Studies deepen these approaches from a much more complex and grounded vision of religion, where the latter is not excluded from the secularization religion binomial, but operates as an element that is both constitutive and critical within itself, within modernity, within the dynamics of post-colonial world. In other words, within Subaltern Studies, a resituated revaluation of the religious predominates, acting even more effectively to a critique of the secular logic that sustain modern Western ideology. My time is almost out, but I would just, Javier, can I read just maybe 2 paragraphs? It's okay, sorry. So, from these readings, we can conclude that post and decolonial theories have the urgent challenge of developing a critical theory of both secularization and religious studies, with the aim of further deepening their critical analysis of the secular matrix that operates in prevailing coloniality, as well as of the critical practices and discourses that exist and are not made visible, especially in a religious perspective. Responding from the same post and decolonial proposal, a critical approach in this field starts from the analysis and promotion of the same critical potential of religious as a way of operating within colonial difference, as Mignolo will suggest, as a type of knowledge and subjectivity that produce a delinking of colonial discourse and matrices, imploding, another term that is used by Mignolo, the hegemonic status of monopolistic senses, in this case, of religious and its political place. Taking up, and I'm finishing with this, Taking up Quijano's classification around the fields of coloniality, we could say that post and decolonial critical theory of religious and the secular must address three dimensions. The first one is a resignification of the processes of religious subjectivation or identity, which questions the coloniality of being in a religious key. Second, a resignification of the way in which religious operates within power relations, which contrasts with the religious matrices of Western power coloniality in a secular Christian key, making visible the countless non-hegemonic ways in which religious voices are mobilized, both within and outside the monopolistic religious identities. Third and final, a resignification of religious as an epistemic category to counter the closing use of religious as a category of modern theories and epistemes, accounting for the Western background that gives rise to this category of religion and the category of religion itself as an invention of modernity within the processes of autonomy and knowledge. Well, I have a few more other points to share, but I prefer to finish here and open dialogue. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you to all our panelists. There's a lot there to talk about. And I just want to say, Nicolas, thank you for making that point there at the very end, because it's my own view that so much of our discourse about globalization, coloniality, decoloniality, even the history, we look at religion as simply derivative in many ways from other kind of pre-existing structure. And I think in some ways that assumption is in itself very colonial, even if it claims to be decolonial, because as many of our indigenous presenters have pointed out, that, you know, the very notion of religion is something that just doesn't occur to a lot of indigenous peoples. I mean, even the notion of worldview, perhaps we might say there is the experience of truth or the experience of the way things are. We heard the use of the term we heard earlier today of diversal ontologies, and in many respects, you know, we look at religion as sort of a predicate of something larger, but in fact, most people, you know, especially when they're coming from, you know, as religious subjects, don't look at the world that way. You know, we heard about Islam before lunch, and, you know, the Islamic point of view, particularly the formation of the episteme, modern science, a lot of it was based on the discoveries of Islamic thinkers. They didn't think, okay, I'm a Muslim and now I'm going to develop an Islamic science. They were developing science, and you can't. The same thing with the development of Indian mathematics. And we know too that many of the indigenous empires of the, you know, what the Spanish call the New World, were very sophisticated in the way they mapped out the universe conceptually and symbolically and so forth. So the question is, you know, do we see these as kind of unique religious or religiously inflected points of view, or do we see them as the point of view, as the very positionality? And I'm very grateful for you making that point, that there is, I mean, particularly in the sociology of religion, you go back to the 1960s and 1970s when theories of modernization were their high water mark. There was also a pushback. It wasn't called decoloniality then, but it was the effort to try to show how so-called emancipatory strategies and symbol matrices are, in a sense, the driving force of many emancipatory political initiatives as well, particularly in the Western world. Even something like liberation theology, which is a kind of strange hybrid of two Western epistemes, that is secular modernism and liberalism and also Marxism, but combined with Catholicism. I mean, in some ways that was a kind of groping to try to find that kind of 0 point, to use Walter Mignola's phrase, where you can begin to leverage against the modernist colonialist episteme. So, all right. Could we, does anyone have any questions, comments? Would any of you like to speak to each other, respond to each other?
I would love to instigate some discussion between my fellow panelists. I have a question for all of them, or you know, as a whole, or also separate. I don't know what to do. I hope we continue this conversation after today. There is something I would like to ask Angelica. I would do it in English slowly. Angelica, you saw Emma's presentation about the Virgen de Guadalupe. And I was very curious to know whether in your fieldwork, in your research, you had found something like that, some figure like that. You know that here in Colombia we have La Virgen de Chiquinquirá, which has some similarities to Guadalupe. But in the south of Colombia, where you were researching, there are many other spiritual heritages at work. So I was curious to know if you found, you know, you said that all of them were Catholic, but I feel that their Catholicism might be very, very different. It's not a institutional Catholicism, but a very eclectic, popular Catholicism. So I was curious to know if you have found any figure that would work as a resistance to these neoliberal, I would say neoliberal theologies at work in these sanitary people, that you know, some sort of figure that the people, that the communities could use to think of alternative ways of life, of maternity, etc., etc.
Bueno, gracias Javier por tu pregunta y gracias también a Emma por esta interesantísima lectura semiótica de la Virgen de Guadalupe, que por supuesto me reenvió inmediatamente al trabajo de campo y me invitó a pensar, en efecto, en una de las figuras también religiosas que estaba muy fuerte cuando yo hablo de la contestación a ciertas normas, cuando hablo de la inversión de esta norma religiosa de la sexualidad prenupcial prohibida, y cuando los jóvenes usan el embarazo o las jóvenes usan el embarazo para legitimar una relación de pareja y desde ahí decidir también sobre su sexualidad, estaba muy fuerte y muy presente en algunos de los relatos biográficos y narrativos. Una virgen que yo creo que podría ser leída también con algunos de los elementos semióticos que nos proporciona Emma en su presentación, y es la Virgen de Iles, una virgen también mestiza de la provincia de Obando al sur, en la frontera con el Ecuador, que en algún momento no fue frontera, de hecho es una frontera también que responde a todo el proceso de modernidad. Y esta virgen es una virgen, le llaman la mestiza, pero también es una virgen indígena y es una virgen racializada, morena. De hecho, me gustaría después de esta presentación volver un poco, y es una virgen que es partera. Entonces, digamos que la sacralización de la maternidad también como un lugar de afirmación y un lugar de decisión. Cuando yo digo se cuestiona el embarazo no deseado, pero aparece esta idea del embarazo como una posibilidad asociada a un vínculo afectivo, y también hay una decisión muy distinto a lo que dice el discurso sanitario. Ahí hay elementos religiosos y aparece, por supuesto, la Virgen de Iles como la Virgen a la que se encomiendan las mujeres en todos sus procesos de parto, sobre todo cuando no hay presencia de, digamos que yo hago el trabajo de campo también en espacios rurales, muy rurales y muy alejados de instituciones de salud. Entonces, la partería rural es una práctica que aparece muy fuerte. Y, digamos, encomendarse a la Virgen de Iles era también una práctica muy presente en las historias de las mujeres biográficas en su momento de parto con sus bebés. No he hecho una lectura con la misma profundidad que la ha hecho Emma, ¿no? Pero por supuesto que toda su presentación me incita muchísimo a pensar en la Virgen de Iles, que es una virgen racializada, le dicen virgen mestiza, pero tiene también muchos elementos indígenas.
Gracias. Thank you, Angelica. Well, I'm happy to keep asking. I want to take this opportunity with my colleagues. As I said, I have a lot. Emma, I would like to ask you a question. Well, in my presentation, I presented the premise that these decolonial thinkers, decolonial precursors, maybe not, they were not very interested in religion, in theology. And I think that Nicolas developed that idea way more. But in your presentation, you discussed a lot from the work of Ansaldúa and Lugones. So I would like to ask you, how do you see? I know that you know the work of Lugones and Ansaldúa very well. I would like to ask you if you agree with that premise that I presented, with the idea that that religion and theology was not very important for their work, in the case of these two very important female thinkers for the decolonial turn.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Javier. And also thank you, Angelica, for your reflections on the connections between our presentations and for the question that you asked Angelica, Javier, because I thought that brought out a lot, especially as we see, just to sort of speak to what Angelica was saying, that we see that La Virgen de Guadalupe isn't the only such Virgen in Latin America. And that's very important because I think it's the evidence sites of contact, right? And what's happening through the processes of colonization and how that carries out, particularly with questions of gender and sexuality. In terms of your question, I think, and I wanna thank you for the invitation to be a part of the panel because it's prompted me to kind of think a little deeper about some of these questions, especially about how religion as such shows up in the work of the Latina feminists that I engage, and particularly thinking about Lugones and Ansaldúa. And so for them, and I really appreciated Nicolas's presentation because it kind of complicated even how we're utilizing the term religion, right? What it signifies, what it's evoking. And the way in which in your introduction, Javier, you spoke about the idea of ancestral knowledges or spirituality being much more present in a lot of decolonial thinkers who are trying to engage in the kind of realm of questions about religion. And so I think with the Latinas that I engage, like Lugones, like Anzalúa, we could also think about others like Chela Sandoval and Emma Perez, about how this question comes up for them. And I think for Lugones, you know, she in many places cites Zulia Marcos's work. So she's thinking a lot about cosmologies, and I would say spiritualities as they are emerging out of indigenous context. So I don't know, I think for Lugones, if you had been talking to her about religion, I mean, obviously she's passed, and she passed away this summer, so we can't ask her like in person, but when you look at her work, I think she would probably be very skeptical of the capacity for institutionalized religion to produce decolonial outcomes because of the histories of how connected particularly Catholicism, right, is to the projects of capitalism and to the projects of colonialism. And so I think maybe Lugones would be skeptical, but if we talked about it in the register of spirituality or ancestral knowledge, we might be able to get to a different place, right? Or even with some of the nuance that we're trying to bring in the panel, I think we could maybe think more deeply with Lugones. For Anzalúa, I also think it's complicated, right? Because Anzalúa is, she identifies as being a new mestiza. So she's reappropriating even the history of mestizaje to think through it and resignify it, I think, in interesting ways. But I think even for Anzalúa, I think, you know, when she is evoking the figure of La Virgen de Guadalupe, wants to reclaim the indigenous meaning by going back to Tonantzin and going to Mexica goddesses like Coalicue, Coyoshauqui, you know, these other kinds of goddesses that are coming out of indigenous context. So I think even for Anzalúa, she's looking to see, okay, where in the uptake of religious practices have knowledges been kept alive, right? What Lugones will talk about is like the infra-political, that exists between the registers of the dominant and the subaltern, that kind of keeps you safe, right? So if we think about how the veneration of La Virgen de Guadalupe keeps ancestral knowledges and lets them fly kind of under the radar of dominant power to help people not be subject to violence, I think that there's a lot there. And one thing that I've been thinking about that your questions also brought out for me is about the difference between who I sometimes call the decolonial dudes. So Mignolo, Quijano, even Nelson's work, you know, Santiago Castro Gómez, like all of these folks who are thinking, and exteriority is a really big part of their theorizing on decoloniality. But for the Latinas that I engage, particularly in the US, in-betweenness or liminality is going to be really much more privileged than the idea of exteriority. And I think that complicates a call like delinking, or even what we can do with religious practices, right? Because I think it's messier than what we let on. And I really thought, I liked that because I felt like it came out in Nicolas's presentation as well. So they're just some thoughts. I think, yeah, something different happens when we think about in-betweenness versus exteriority. And I think that's an important concentration that Latina feminisms, decolonial feminisms out of that are being developed by Latinas bring out, right? And allow us to think in more complex ways about you know, what holds decolonial possibilities.
Thank you, Emma.
I just wanted to say that Mignolo, in his book on decoloniality, makes a point of not using the word religion, but of spirituality. And that's a term, particularly in the academic world, that we seem to avoid. I don't know, maybe it's because of the way in which so much of indigenous practices has been appropriated primarily in the previous generation by what is called New Age spirituality and so forth. But the term spirituality is a very old term. And in fact, Emma just talked about the spirit and spiritual and so forth. It's like the idea of spirituality means that you're not cutting it up according to certain kind of linguistic structures in which we've used. I mean, if you read, for example, a book by the South African scholar, David Chittister's Empires of Religion, you know, he makes a very provocative, highly, extremely well-documented empirical case about how talk about religion is in itself a form of colonial administration. And when we start breaking things up taxonomically, that is, you know, categories of A and not A, B, C, and you know, even the whole rhetoric of identity politics, which has become something that's been reified. We forget that what's really at stake here is a kind of world. I don't say worldview, I say a world that you experience in a way that's not necessarily that of the language of the dominant discourse. In fact, you may not have the right discourse to even communicate it other than to talk in the way that your ancestors did, or your, your grandmothers. So, I mean, it's like we had a little, I was trying to get to that point earlier today about, you know, how we have to stop talking as being on either side of the boundary, interior, exterior, and the idea of border thinking, which I've always appreciated. My deceased colleague and good friend, Luis Leon, used to, you know, always talk about what border thinking really means. It's a fluid border. A border means you're passing back and forth. And all of us tend to feel more comfortable on one side of the border, but in a sense, we can't think just on our side of the border, because that is exactly what colonial thinking is about. So I'm wondering if we could start thinking of something that might be called a kind of decolonial spirituality, that it couldn't be codified into a particular language. I mean, Walter Mignolo, who I know very well, I had him in a class last night, which was part of another deal. He kept talking about breaking the code. Well, you know, we break the code, but or do we then have silence? You know, no, we have to speak. You know, we have to speak intersubjectively. We have to speak from one side of the boundary of subject to subject, you know, which from the subjective standpoint is called the subject-object relationship, which is a Cartesian distinction, but in fact, subject-object, when it comes to those who have voices, those who are speaking, it's subject speaking to subject, and it's this oscillation back and forth between the I and the you, or the you and the I. You know, this is very important, because the notion of the you is not gendered. The very notion of the you means that somehow I have to encounter you as you are. You know, that's what I understood the phrase this morning, you know, to recognize with dignity the other as other, not that you other them, you know, you make them an other, something on the other side of the boundary, but you let them appear who they are within their voice. And even if you don't speak the same language, there is still this intersubjective relationship that happens time and time again and very profoundly. And it happens not just across the gender line, it happens across the cultural line, it happens across the linguistic line. I can speak to my Vienna colleague, in English, ich kann Deutsch auch, but I don't usually, because English is a privileged language. So it's sort of part of the de rigueur. But when I'm speaking to a European, my ancestry is from Eastern Europe. But I'm also speaking across language barriers and so forth. But there yet is that kind of inner subjectivity that, is always involved in whatever we're doing. And instead of trying to make this an even more differential process, how can we break it down further? Maybe we need to start looking at where we speak from and how we speak to each other. And I would call that decolonial spirituality. I don't know, since we're talking about religion, I think this is an appropriate time to bring this up. But, most of the religions of the world have been attempts at that in some particular way.
I have a question for the panelists, if that's okay, kind of going along with Carl's thoughts. Is that all right? Good. This question of Walter Mignolo's and other decolonialist thinkers' shyness around using words like religion, which of course have a problematic background, a very European background, and using spirituality instead. Carl talked about this, our panelists talk about this, Nicolas and Javier especially. I feel like using words like spirituality, at least in an English-speaking register, it has the issues of falling into the trap of kind of an individualism that almost like borders on solipsism, right? Because one of the, and maybe that's just coming at this from like an individualistic register that it comes from in the US and the English-speaking world, because that's also a product of kind of European secularism, right? To say that like religion or spirituality is something that an individual does, within the confines of the private space, and it never goes out into public, and it never goes into anything collective, which is its own form of any kind of, it never develops into any form of collectivity, which is its own kind of colonization. So I guess my question is how do you, as thinkers, as researchers, theoretically get around this? Because I understand this this desire in the Latin American context, which isn't my specialization, to not want to engage with institutional religion, especially because of the colonial history. But when you talk about spirituality or lived spirituality of people, what are some ways to make it not so solipsistic or individual? Is that kind of already present in some of these indigenous communities to have a more collective spirituality? That would be an interesting question for Angelica, who did some of the field work. So if that makes sense, that's my question. Yeah.
Bueno, yo agradezco inmensamente esa pregunta porque contiene un abordaje muy importante dentro de mis conclusiones y mis resultados, que quizás no lo expuse acá, pero yo planteaba que la perspectiva de las instituciones en procesos de prevención de embarazo, que tiene que ver con la regulación de la sexualidad y que tiene que ver con el control de los cuerpos o el gobierno de los cuerpos de las mujeres, tiene una perspectiva, al ser transnacional, absolutamente individualista y por lo tanto absolutamente vinculada como a letos de la modernidad, a la ética de la modernidad. Y me planteaba que las decisiones procreativas, yo no hablé en mi trabajo, en mi tesis de religión como tal, pero sí hablé de perspectivas morales, comunitarias. Y lo que me planteaba es que cuando se hacen intervenciones en el trabajo de campo, se debe considerar, al menos en este contexto situado, desde una epistemología situada también, no solamente en la producción de conocimiento, sino en la intervención, se deben considerar unas subjetividades relacionales. Hay varios trabajos que hablan de que los procesos de individuación en América Latina deberían considerarse como procesos de individuación colectivos y relacionales. Y por supuesto eso tiene que ver con el abandono estatal de los estados neoliberales, pero entonces cuando nosotros entendemos las subjetividades relacionales, dejamos de aproximarnos a la noción del embarazo adolescente como un accidente y lo comprendemos como una decisión que responde también a esa necesidad colectiva de pertenencia familiar. Y ahí entendemos un poco lo que yo planteaba, que es el imperativo moral comunitario de el miedo a la soltería femenina, que no es solamente una norma religiosa o moral, sino que es también una forma de resistencia a un Estado neoliberal que nos plantea como única forma de sobrevivir la pertenencia familiar, ¿no? La pertenencia, y entonces yo construyo una subjetividad absolutamente relacional y desde ahí la maternidad tiene un lugar distinto al accidente o tiene un lugar distinto al evento indeseado y empieza a ser una forma de resistir, de pervivir, de sobrevivir. No sé si respondo.
It's helpful, thank you.